Before we start, here's a question. How does a top grandmaster win without rushing, without forcing tactics early, and without ever losing control? In this game, a 3000 rated grandmaster does exactly that. No wild gambits, no cheap tricks, just quiet pressure that slowly turns into a crushing attack. Grandmaster versus grandmaster. And by the end, one side never even gets a chance to fight back. Let's take a look. White begins with pawn to b3, entering the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack. The idea here is flexibility. White avoids heavy theory and keeps the position open. Black replies with knight to f6, a solid developing move that controls the center. White follows up with bishop to b2, placing the bishop on the long diagonal and immediately putting pressure on the center. Black plays pawn to g6, preparing a kingside fianchetto. White continues with pawn to c4, controlling important central squares from the flank. Black develops the bishop to g7, completing the fianchetto. White plays pawn to g3, preparing the second bishop. Black castles, prioritizing king safety. White develops with bishop to g2, and now both bishops are active and pointing toward the center. Black plays pawn to d6, supporting the e5 break. White responds with pawn to d4, finally claiming central space. Black pushes pawn to e5, gaining space but also creating long-term targets. White develops with knight to f3, immediately putting pressure on the center. Black plays knight to c6, reinforcing the central pawns. White castles, finishing development. Black pushes pawn to e4, locking the center and defining the structure. Now comes a very deep idea. White plays knight to e1, which looks passive at first glance, but this knight is heading to c2, then to e3 and eventually to d5. Black responds with bishop to f5, activating the piece but slightly neglecting development. White continues calmly with knight to c3. Black pushes pawn to h5, signaling aggressive intentions on the kingside. White stays true to the plan and plays knight to c2. Black plays queen to d7, connecting the rooks and preparing pressure. White places a rook on e1, lining up on the open file. Black mirrors this with rook to e8. White brings the knight to e3, reaching its ideal square. Black plays bishop to h3, trying to provoke weaknesses around the king. White calmly retreats with bishop to h1, showing no fear. Black pushes pawn to h4, but this is starting to look like overextension. White plays queen to d2, fully coordinating the pieces. Black plays bishop to h6, and this is where things start to go wrong. White jumps in with knight to d5, hitting the center at exactly the right moment. Black responds with bishop takes d2, grabbing material but completely missing the tactical danger. White strikes with knight takes f6 with check, a powerful sacrifice that blows open the position. Black is forced to play king to f8. White keeps the initiative with knight takes d7 with check, dragging the king further into danger. Black replies with bishop takes d7. White then plays knight takes e4, regaining material and emerging with full control of the position. Black plays bishop takes e1, grabbing more material in desperation. White responds instantly with rook takes e1, keeping the position under control. Black tries to create counterplay with pawn takes g3. White calmly recaptures with pawn takes g3, keeping the structure solid. Black plays bishop to g4, increasing pressure. White answers with bishop to c3, a quiet but extremely strong improving move. Black pushes pawn to f5, the best defensive try. White plays knight to g5, increasing pressure around the king. Black grabs material with rook takes e2, but this only worsens the position. White jumps in with knight to e6 with check, giving black no time to breathe. Black plays king to f7, but the king remains exposed. White simplifies with rook takes e2. Black recaptures with bishop takes e2. White plays knight takes c7, winning a pawn and completely dominating the board. White removes a key defender with knight takes d6. Then comes the decisive blow, knight takes f5 with check, which effectively ends the game. From here, white converts with perfect technique. The king steps forward, the pieces coordinate, and the passed pawns start rolling. Pawn to d7. Pawn to c5. Pawn to c6. Pawn to c7. Promotion is unavoidable and black resigns. This game is a perfect example of how elite players punish overextension, value initiative over material, and convert winning positions without giving counterplay. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.